edition of the Calling It How I See It Sports Pod. I'm Blake Terrence here with you. Got Q here and his lovely wife Amanda. They're here to talk some sporting Kansas City. Some big news on that front as Peter Vermes recently let go. That was about 2 weeks ago now as we sit here and record this, week and a half ago. Longest tenured coach in the MLS, had been with Sporting KC since 2009, was there for their 2013 MLS Cup run. And of the quick and dirty research we did in the prep, nobody else comes to mind from MLB, NFL, NBA. I'm not as well versed on the NHL, so there could be somebody missing there. But looks like maybe the only longer tenured active coach was Mike Tomlin, who took over the Steelers in 2007. So certainly an end of an era here. Guys, I'm going to let you lead this conversation. Of course, you guys are the soccer fans, but as I've been reading up on this, obviously Sporting KC's been going through a rough last couple of years. In 23, they kind of had that magical run where I think they had a 10-game losing streak, or at least a winless streak. They might have a few draws in there, but definitely a rough stretch in 23 after they missed the playoffs the year before. Then they kind of went on that magical second half run, snuck into the playoffs, knocked off St. Louis as the top seed. So that's probably what gave him a little wind behind his sails and got himself a big fat contract extension right after that year. And, well, he made it exactly a year and 6 games into that deal before he was fired. So a lot of people unhappy about the timing of it all. But what are your guys' biggest takeaways as we transition to a new era of soccer here?
Yeah, well, I think Peter Vermes is an interesting case because a lot of times, especially in American soccer, there's a lot of turnover and obviously not as many big names as you see in other sports. But when you're talking about face of the franchise, Peter Vermes was kind of known as that guy throughout the MLS, being a consistent presence for Sporting for so many years. He played for the team for many years and then obviously took over as coach in 2009, coached for 16 years with the club. He won the MLS Cup in 2013 and finished at the top of the standings, actually 4 times. So he's definitely well loved by Sporting fans, but the results on the field the last couple of seasons are ultimately what did him in. I don't know, Amanda, what your thoughts are, but I think a lot of people thought that the game may have passed him by a bit in terms of tactics and just not really being able to maximize his talent on the field towards the end anyways. What do you think, Amanda?
I agree with that. He relied on 4-3 the last probably 4 or 5 years since we've been going to games, and a lot of coaches have started going just beyond that. They're going, just not 4-3, and it's just they're able to sneak the ball in and score a lot more. We were there on Saturday when the assistant head coach was named the interim head coach, and he still relied on 4-3, but at least we got the job done and actually won our first game in under 10 games, and that hasn't happened the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, it is kind of ironic that they had their best performance the game after they fired him and against our biggest rival in state, St. Louis. So
yep. That is always seems like how it goes. A team loses a coach. It's like in the NCAA tournament, if you're looking for a team to kind of be a sleeper and make it further than you expect, you always want a team. McNeese was an example of that this year. Will Wade got a promotion. I can't remember exactly what job he took. They were already, some people were picking them a little bit, but you always get a little bit of tailwind when they're playing for a coach on his way out or a new coach coming in. I certainly had heard a lot of that about how the strategy and just the tactics of the game had maybe passed him by. Kyle had made the analogy when we talked about this privately in the past that he kind of became Bill Belichick toward the end of his era with the New England
Mhm.
Patriots, where he thought he just could be in charge of everything. Got um, a bit in love with his own success, if you will. Uh, and certainly, again, like this is all research I've just done today, but there certainly seems to have been some tension within the organization. Even in press conferences, there were times where he would not so subtly throw shade at the owners for, not helping him close deals to add big pieces to the roster, et cetera. And then, but as Kyle has also made the point, there was a time where he operated with one of the biggest budgets in MLS. So, certainly, it seemed like a guy that, I wonder if maybe he might go find quite a bit of success elsewhere when he's gotten a bit of a perspective check. Did you guys get that sense at all that maybe he'd gotten a bit full of himself or a bit in love with his own success? Because there certainly did seem from my crash course that I taught myself, there seemed to be some tension just within the organization as well.
Well, like I said, they spent $9 million on Polito, and half the time he would get hurt and be sitting on the bench or up
Yeah, I
in
know
the
that didn't go well.
suites. And it's just he spent so much money on all these players that we thought was going to be good, and then nope. They just ended up being injured. Johnny Russell, who was the captain the last, I think, 5 years, he wanted to stay, but Vermes just could not come up with a contract for him, and I feel like he could have stayed at least one more year. Same with Melia, even though Melia retired on Saturday, but I don't know about you,
Yeah,
Q.
that's a good point. Like a lot of the faces of the franchise actually departed this past off season, and I don't. It's hard to know how much of that was, actually they couldn't come to an agreement, or maybe Peter just feeling like, you know, he wanted to take the team in his own direction. Um, I do think there was a bit of a lack of accountability on his part after losses. He rarely would talk about the things that went wrong. He'd rather talk about, you know, things that they did right, even when they don't win their first 10 games of the season. So
Are you saying he had toxic positivity?
that's a interesting term for it. Yeah, I think that sums it up well. Maybe even when they weren't doing well, he was like, "Well, let's find the positives in this."
Yeah,
He's the
when
guy who cries flesh wound after all his limbs have been cut off. Like,
well, like I said, like you said, 2023, we went the first 10 games without winning our first game, and that shows you how much of credibility he did not criticize for all the downfalls. He would say positive things, and it'd be on to the next game. And it
right.
wasn't until later that season when I think Johnny Russell and all the really high players that are good sportsmanship, they all rearranged the team bonding at a cabin where they all hashed out all of their criticisms to each other and where everyone is going wrong, and then that's kind of what changed the momentum of the season. Do you
Yeah,
remember that
I
too?
don't. I do remember that, and I don't. Was that was just a fully player driven thing, wasn't it?
Yes, it wasn't even
He was involved.
Peter Vermes' idea. I think it was Johnny Russell and a couple other players. They're like, we need to hash it out because we're getting nowhere. We have.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it
So I
kind
mean,
of
and
gives.
it's
Go ahead.
no major shade to Vermees. I mean, there's a reason coaches don't last with the same team for 20, close to 20 seasons. It just, there comes a time when you have to have that perspective change. Like you were saying, Blake, I don't know, the fact that he's been with this particular club for so long, Is there a chance for him to go somewhere else and start fresh? Maybe. But I do think this team, and it wasn't just the product on the field. We have friends who are season ticket holders, who have just noted kind of the decline of the overall fan experience over the last few
Is
years.
Cauldron not what it used to be?
No, the Cauldron is great. The Cauldron is kind of the beating heart of the franchise, I would say. The just the overall stadium experience, the vendors, the less fan engagement with
Hmm.
players and things like that.
I feel
Um,
like ever since Herzl kind of had to resign 2 years ago, it's just the
Yeah,
beat
that was a
of
bad
the
deal.
chants and whatnot.
Yeah.
They're
I
not
think that was
bringing
more of a
in the
symptom than
crowd.
the cause, but yeah, I get what you're saying. Like they made a lot of changes that the fans didn't appreciate. Again, how much was Vermes a part of all those decisions? It's hard to say, but I think a fresh direction is needed, and I think everyone was surprised to see it happen after 6 games. I, for one, thought they were going to give him at least the rest of this season,
Hmm.
but I think you started seeing disengagement from the fans, which is really what forced their hand to make this change.
Yeah, well, we were talking about like how Vermees didn't seem to acquit himself too well. You know, uh, that article was citing several press conferences over the last couple of years where he would just make not so subtle backhanded comments toward ownership, which, I know that things have changed recently in MLS and the playing field is more even and they're not able to outspend everybody like they maybe once did, but certainly not covering yourself in glory with your bosses there. But yeah, I mean, let's talk about that angle of it. Amanda, you sounded like you maybe had some insight into that whole deal, but yeah, I mean, Q referenced there how strange it is. I mean, it's it's a bad place to be in as an ownership. I mean, they're wasting a ton of money because they owe the rest of Vermees' contract, which is like 4.9 years. It was a 5-year extension that started last year. Then they got to pay, um, oh god, Carey something, the new coach, the interim, and
Mm.
then whether they keep him or not, they're gonna have to pony up even more money to get the new permanent coach, assuming at the end of this year. So there's no way to spin firing him when they did as good for the team and the organization. Why do you think they did it when they did? I mean, 6 games into a year, there's not enough of a sample size to. You didn't do it because of something that happened in the first 6 games. You still got 80% of the contract to go. So, like you said, Q, it couldn't have probably hurt to let him play out the full season, or if you really decided that things were untenable, at least fire him at the end of last season so you have a whole off season to make to have some interviews and to do the transfer window or however it works in MLS. What was with the timing of it all?
I think it's with how the last 3 seasons have gone, where we've been at the bottom of the totem pole. We barely squeaked through in 2023. It all came down to that last game. I think we won against Timbers, but I can't remember who it was, but they lost, which kind of gave us that number 8 seed. But
Mm-hmm.
I think it just came down to the last couple seasons. I think last year we probably didn't win our first game until probably game 9 or 10 again. So I think it just all came down to how he would finish the game. Like, he would leave players on way too long than when it was necessary. He would also rely on old players that were in their late 30s, like Roger
Yeah.
Espinoza and Matt Beasler when he was still part of SKC.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot that came into it, and I feel like the interim coach will definitely be an impact because like he put in young players that haven't had the much experience when we went and saw them on Saturday, and I feel like they did pretty well.
Hmm.
Yeah. So specifically, why do you think they didn't fire him at the end of last year if they were already so at their wits' end with him? What do you gain by firing him at the very beginning of the next season when, you gotta, this new coach has got to basically coach the full year now with this hanging over his head. Plus, you let Vermees make all the big decisions this past offseason, so he was still shaping the team right up until he left. Why do you think they held on to him through the offseason?
I think, well, I was told that or people saw that they were part of the U.S. Championship Cup. And since I think this was like last year's team that qualified, so I feel like they probably relied on him till up to that point. So that was the beginning of February. So that our first game
Oh,
was
so it was
against Miami.
before, it was after the season. It was like it was in the off season that cup was then.
Yes.
Soccer
Okay,
is very interesting in that way, where things like the U.S. Open Cup outside of the regular season can stretch from one year to
right.
the next. So even though it's technically the off season, you're still working with the same team. You're still, training with the same players and coaches and things. So it is. There's almost not a great time to fire a coach like there is in the NFL offseason. I would also
Yeah.
say I would also remind everyone that this was the first season of a 5-year extension. Firing him after 1 year in that extension, I think, would have been a really poor look. Not that this is much better, but I do
Yeah.
think I do think the start to the season. You were saying it's not much of a sample size. I think it was enough to be a confirmation of the issues that we saw last year,
Mhm.
where it was beyond just the record. It was the lack of energy, effort, just creativity. It just felt stale, like it did last year, like it did the year before, up until that players only meeting. So I think it just. I don't think they wanted to fire him midseason, but I think he forced their hand with the performance that the team was given.
Well,
Well, you know
like
what? Go ahead.
you can go.
Well, I was about to say this is exactly why I have you guys on to talk soccer. These are the nuances that I would miss. Like essentially what I learned here through that little bit you just did there, Q, is two things. One, the soccer season, we know it's very different just as a sport than most of our popular American sports, but maybe the one of the key things to take away from that is it's not the season versus off-season things not nearly as cut and dry as it is for the other, not no shade at the NHL, but the other three major sports, like NBA, NFL and MLB, you very rarely see mid-season firings. And when they are mid-season, it's really like tail end of season, some interim guy that got, in a good place with the front office gets a pay boost for a few games, and then they actually find the new guy in the offseason. Everything is there's a cycle, there's a way things go in all those sports. Like once you have become a fan of those sports for just a couple of years, you know when that's gonna like we know when to start talking about the hot seats. And it's not after week 2 of the regular season, for example, in the NFL. That's not when to talk about who's on the hot seat. You could talk about it for later, but you don't expect those firings then because there's a time and a place where those things happen. So maybe that's just one way that soccer is different. And I also like, you made the point there about how, you know, there is because of perhaps the off-season differences there, and also just because of how the differences in the sport, maybe you can learn a lot from a smaller sample size there. For example, like if John Sherman after the 2022 season had, decided, okay, well, we're not very happy with Dayton Moore, but we're still not sure about JJ Piccolo, so I'm just going to sit on my thumbs and do nothing. And then at the end of April of 23, it said, okay, now it's JJ Piccolo. That would have, we would have officially just abandoned ship at this point. It would just be like this, everyone that does decisions in this organization is dumb. Like, that's just, it was hopeless at that point. It's maybe
Well,
not that simple with soccer.
it's funny you bring up Dayton Moore. I think Dayton Moore is kind of a good analog for
For
Peter Vermees
Vermees, yeah,
in
I
some
thought that too when
ways.
you were talking about that.
I mean, he doesn't have. didn't have he wasn't the manager, obviously, like Vermees was directly the coach, but
Hmm.
both of them won championships earlier in their career, and that kind of bought them maybe more time than they should have had. Um, and both give you kind of the feeling that the game passed them by in a way, and they weren't able to adjust in the way that the sport was going. So I do think that's an interesting comparison there,
Yeah, yeah.
but yeah, I think it's definitely a new era for the team, and we're excited to see where it goes. Got off to a good start this past weekend.
Amanda, do you remember what you were going to say?
I was just saying. Now we bought two players two seasons ago with Sporting, and now they're not really being starters because we have other players that we want to experience with.
Hmm.
Well, and even more ridiculous that Vermees wants to make backhanded comments at ownership about not having enough money. Sounds like he's not really spending the money he does have very wisely either.
Well,
So,
from what I've heard, is that in this past off season, we actually had the most money that we've had in a while, and we spent, I think, a ton on our number 9 because we got rid of Polito, and then we got I think one forward and one midfielder for $5 million combined. So, and they've done really well with the 3 that we have acquired.
Yeah, it seems like they actually made a pretty good offseason move. They got a star player from the was it LA Galaxy?
Yeah, LA
And,
Galaxy.
he scored like 20 goals last year, but it was a deal where they were kind of running up against the salary cap. They couldn't afford to pay this guy, so it was actually the first player for cash swap in MLS history
Mm-hmm.
to bring this guy. I can't say his name. Dejan Joveljic, something
That
like
seems
that.
about right.
Joe
Uh,
Velich, maybe? Yeah, I don't know.
yeah, from LA to KC, and he's played really well so far.
He's our top
Um,
scorer right now with 4 goals. He had a brace on Saturday.
yeah, he's 25 years old and seems like he could be a face of the franchise moving forward. So maybe Peter did left us one parting gift on the way out.
There you go. All's well that ends well. All right. Well, I appreciate you guys joining us for a little Sporting KC talk. Maybe we'll make that more of a regular. Got to find a couple more soccer heads to come on with us. But glad Sporting KC seems to be heading in the right direction now. So stay tuned to the Calling It How I See It Sports Pod.